This is our third lecture of Arabs in Sindh, and we had done it to the point where Derryl Maclean questions the earlier views about conversions in Sindh, and goes on now to discuss the Hindu and Buddhist response to the Arab invasion and the long-term effect on these two religions that were prevalent in this region at that time. Evidence shows that the Buddhists tended to collaborate to a greater extent, and ultimately Buddhism disappeared completely as a viable religious system during the Arab period itself. On the other hand, the Hindus collaborated lesser than the Buddhists, and Hinduism also continued to survive in the region. The issue of Buddhist collaboration became important in second resources that were looking for reasons behind the fall of Sindh. It was stated that Sindh was lost to the Arabs due to the treason of the Sindhi Buddhists. However, this theory has been challenged by Dhar and Friedman, who argue that both Buddhists and Hindus collaborated, and it's incomplete to just single out one religion. So, Maclean goes on to re-examine this data to see what is the evidence of collaboration pertaining to both these communities, and whether or not collaboration was actually responsible for the military collapse of Sindh. Now, the source that forms the basis for these theories of Buddhist collaboration are sources like the Chachnama, where it seems that every Buddhist name in the source is a collaborator. On the other hand, various Hindus are named, but only one appears to be a collaborator in that early period. The crucial point is not that some Hindus collaborated, if one were to study these primary sources, but it seems that there is not one example in the sources of an individual Buddhist or a group of Buddhists who did not collaborate with the Arabs. In addition, Buddhists also appear to have collaborated early on in the campaign before the major conquest had been achieved, and if sometimes even before the conquest of towns where they were resident. For example, the Niruni Buddhists are supposed to have sent envoys to Al-Hajjaj requesting a separate peace before the forces of Qasim were even dispatched to Sindh, according to the sources. Thus, one has to now, as you know, as us as researchers, and we have to go deeper and see why is it that the evidence points towards this collaboration. Friedman had offered a very simplistic kind of explanation, stating that it was opportunistic because they wanted to be on the winning side. However, the evidence of this collaboration is from the period when there was no indication that the Arabs would be on the winning side. And they had conquered only some portions of the Indus Delta, and the resistance that was offered from in Sindh by Raja Dahir was still intact. His large army was still intact, and the major part of Sindh had not been taken. However, the Buddhists went out of their way to help out the Arabs, even in conditions of considerable personal jeopardy. The Sivistani Buddhists not only went over to the Arabs before the town had been conquered, but they were also put in some condition of peril when the town had been retaken by the forces of Chandram Hala. However, once again they opted for the Arabs, closing the gates of the city against Chandram when the battle was taking place. On the other hand, the Hindus who did collaborate, their examples are there. Siakar, Kaksha, and there were also the Brahmins of Brahmanabad. They collaborated only after Dahir had been killed and his army defeated. Even after Dahir's death, the Hindus of Upper Sindh, and in this area there were fewer Buddhists, so the Hindus in Upper Sindh did not submit easily. The fighting at Multan, which was the last city to be taken by the Arabs, was quite severe, and the campaign was quite extended. So the main military resistance against the Arabs, both during and after the conquest, was under the leadership of individuals who were Hindus. Buddhists were not the only collaborators in Sindh, nor were all Buddhists necessarily collaborators. Some Hindus also collaborated, some cooperated, some resisted. However, in general, Maclean's conclusion is that there is a clear distinction between Hindu and Buddhist reactions to the Arab invasion of Sindh, whereas Buddhists tended to collaborate in larger numbers and at earlier date and more completely than the Hindus. Next subheading is regarding extension and survival. Buddhism ceased to exist in Sindh after the Arab conquest because the Muslim travelers passing through Sindh after this conquest do not refer to Buddhists in Sindh. Al-Biruni, who visited Sindh, was unable to find any Buddhist informants for his encyclopedia on Indian religions, and he had to rely on Hindu and other Muslim sources for his information. In addition, none of the surviving Buddhist structures in Sindh were built after the Muslim conquest, with the exception of the stupa at Mirpur Khas, where Arab coins have been found. So, it's reasonable to conclude that Buddhism died out in Sindh during the course of the Arab rule, and in the remains of the Buddhist monasteries, there's complete absence of Arab period artifacts, which suggests that Buddhism declined in this area quite early and was finally terminated. Hinduism, on the other hand, never disappeared, excluding in Multan. Around half of the population of Sindh, Maclean, was Hindu at the time of the Arab conquest. Even in 1911, which was 1200 years after the conquest of Qasim of the city of Derryl, which had been conquered in 711. So in 1911, about a quarter of the population of the British province of Sindh was still Hindu. So the Hindu population ranged from 10% in Upper Sindh Frontier District to as high as 44% in Thar Parkar District. So in this long span of Muslim rule here, Hinduism had lost only half of its adherents. The Muslim authors who visited this area frequently refer to the Hindus of the region, whereas they do not really refer to even a single Buddhist. The geographer Makdisi, who visited Sindh around 985 CE, refers to the flourishing condition of the Hindu temples of the region and the wealth that came to these temples because of women, particularly women who were working in the temples. And these women also received religious endowments. So this is referring to the Devadasis. So not only did Hinduism survive in the Tara period, it even attracted Muslims, and Makdisi encountered a Muslim who had converted to Hinduism in Sindh, and however then returned back to Islam when he left Sindh to go to Nishapur. So while Hinduism continued to flourish, Buddhism disappeared. However, one cannot conclude that Buddhists converted en masse to Islam. There are other options, like they could have emigrated from Sindh to other parts of South Asia where Buddhism was thriving, or they became Hindus and merged into the Hindu population, and possibly some converted. So these all three processes can be observed from the sources. A number of Buddhist monks from Sindh emigrated to other parts of Buddhist South Asia, and there are occasional references in the sources to Sindhi Buddhists living in Bengal and Bihar during the reign of the Palas, which was a dynasty that actively patronized Buddhism. The Tibetan historian Taranath records an earlier tradition that Sindhi Buddhist monks joined with a group of Sinhalese to destroy certain tantric images and scriptures at Bodh Gaya during the reign of the Pala king Dharmapal, which is from 770 to 810 CE. This account seems to have some historicity. Since there is the mention in inscriptions from the Pala period of names of two Sindhi Buddhists, Purnadas and Dharmabhim. However, there were also sectarian clashes within Buddhism, and the Sindhis did not find a safe refuge in eastern India because they began aggressive attempts to convert local Mahayanists to the Theravada perspective, which resulted in the execution of many of these migrant Sindhi Buddhists. Buddhist monks from Sindh also migrated to other regions of Gujarat, which were ruled by the Rashtrakoot dynasty. Two inscriptions of Gurjar Rashtrakoot kings Danti Varman I and Dhruva II, belonging to around 789 CE and belonging to 857 CE and 884 CE record the grant of a number of villages near Surat for the maintenance of the Samitiya monks from Sindh. So whereas some monks seem to have emigrated, it's unlikely that the large scale Buddhist population migrated. They would have continued to live wherever they were and possibly merge into the Hindu population. And it's possible that the Sindhi Buddhists became Hindus. This is also generally the explanation that's given for the decline of Buddhism in other parts of India in the 12th century CE. And it's stated that Buddhists had become Hinduized due to the adoption of Mahayana and Tantric beliefs, and in practice they differed very little from the Hindus. Thus they were gradually assimilated into the inclusive Hinduism and eventually were totally absorbed and Buddhism became extinct. However, according to Maclean, this explanation cannot be applied to Sindh at least, because the Buddhists of Sindh belong to the Samitiya school of Theravada. They were not Mahayanists or Tantrayanists at the time of the conquest. In addition, the available evidence also points to the kind of dislike the Sindhi Buddhists had for the Hinduized Buddhism, because they are known to have started preaching for Theravada in eastern India, and they burnt tantric scriptures in the Vajrasan monastery and also destroyed the silver image of Hevajra, which is a tantric Buddhist deity. So the Samitiya school of Buddhism, a form of Theravada, is noted to have existed in other parts of India by the historian Taranath, who was writing in the 16th century CE. However, it is in Sindh that it had disappeared by the 10th century CE. Thus, it's unlikely that the Buddhists became Hindu because of the Hinduization of their belief system in Sindh. However, this does not mean that they did not convert to Hinduism. There is no direct evidence of Buddhists becoming Hindu in Sindh, but it's quite possible that a larger number would have become Hindu. Also, it seems that primarily at the rural level, the Buddhists were absorbed into Hinduism, where pressures of accommodation were greater than the urban areas, which were more Islamic in their orientation. The possibility that Buddhists tended to convert to Islam also has to be examined. The evidence given for this view has been demographic. Sindh has been divided into two general areas, where Buddhists were primarily in Lower Sindh at the time of the Arab conquest, and the Upper Sindh was almost entirely Hindu. There are indications that during the Arab period, the people of Lower Sindh were converted to Islam and Islamized at a more rapid rate and greater degree than Upper Sindh. For example, the Arab sources refer to 13 towns or cities of Sindh possessing mosques, and only one of these, that is at Multan, is in Upper Sindh, while 9 are in Lower Sindh, 2 in Maclean and 1 in Turan. Thus, one can reasonably assume that the presence of mosques reflects Islamization, and Lower Sindh was Islamized to a greater extent. Then Upper Sindh, and Islamization of course also would mean conversion. Specific towns in Lower Sindh known to have been predominantly Buddhist at the time of the Arab conquest were definitely Muslim by the 10th century. For example, the town of Savandi, a major Buddhist center with an important monastery, was Muslim by the time the historian Baladhuri were writing, which is around 892 CE. Then Aror, which was the south site of a Buddhist monastery, and Nirun, whose Buddhist governors and inhabitants actively aided the Arabs, also were Muslim by around 990 CE, when another writer, Muslim writer, wrote this book, Kitab al-Azizi. Thus, one has to look at deeper reasons behind the Sindhi Buddhist response to Islam, and one has to examine other features of religion and the socio-economic base of Sindhi Buddhism, particularly its class composition. Whenever the Arab sources refer to the Sindhi Buddhist collaborators, they are listed as merchants and artisans, or in connection with some kind of connection with commerce. When the Arabs besieged the fort of Morj in the region of Sivistan, its Buddhist inhabitants advised the Hindu governor Bajra Chandar to submit to the Arabs because they were afraid that their lives and wealth would be lost. So it seems that there was a concern of the Buddhists with retaining their possession, and this was an important consideration for the community, that when Bajra rejected their offer to make peace with the Arabs, they again approached him, and he again was unwilling. So they decided to secure a separate peace with the Arabs, and the aim was to retain the capital intact. And this aim seems to have been fulfilled, because when the Arabs took the fort, Muhammad entered the city It is mentioned in the sources that wherever he found, he confiscated the gold and other valuables, except from the Buddhists or the Samanians, with whom he had contracted a firm treaty earlier. It also appears that the Buddhists of the region must have possessed considerable quantity of capital in gold, silver, and other valuables which they wanted to safeguard. The mercantile orientation of the Buddhists of Sivistan is also clear from a section in the Chachnama, where after a small revolt by certain Brahmin loyalists was put down, the Arabs were welcomed by a group of Buddhist merchants and artisans. At Aror, the mercantile and artisanal classes are said to have renounced their allegiance to the Brahmins, and they opened the city to the Arabs and retired to the temple at the local Buddhist monastery to worship. At Savandi, in the Brahmanabad region, the people were all Buddhists, said to be Buddhist idol worshippers and merchants in the Arab sources. The area was centered on a Buddhist monastery, and which was under the influence of Buddha Raku, who was the abbot of the monastery. This very prominent Buddhist monk of the time of Chach is said to have had in his possessions wealth, slaves, estates, which he found were under threat because of the rise of the Brahman Church. There are also references to the irrigated fields of the Buddhist temple and references that agricultural land was attached to the monastery, which was at that time under Buddha Raku. And this monastic complex was located on the outskirts of the city of Brahmanabad. The mercantile interests and perspectives of the Buddhist inhabitants of the Indus Delta city of Nirun were again there is evidence that they entered into an early peace with the Arabs, Aman, and then they opened the gates of the city and began buying and selling with the soldiers. Certain Buddhists from the city aided the Arabs in purchasing supplies. Thus, the Niruni Buddhists must have had a substantial knowledge of and concern for commerce and began collaborating economically with the Arabs pretty early on. The Nirunis were not the only Sindhi Buddhists using the financial knowledge for the benefit of the Arabs. There is evidence that when the Thakafite army was experiencing severe scarcity, another Buddhist intervened and imported the necessary supplies, working in cooperation with the major merchants of the Indus Delta. Then Maclean examines the location of the Buddhist structures in Sindh and points out that how Buddhist monasteries of Central Asia and China had been located along trade routes, provided capital loans and facilities for merchants, particularly merchants who were involved in inter-regional commerce, and the same had been suggested for the Buddhist monasteries of the Deccan, who fulfilled a similar function in the Indian subcontinent. According to Maclean, the similar role can be seen in Sindh. One important trade route proceeded from the Indus Delta, either directly across the Thar Desert or via Aror, and across the Rajputana Desert to Mathura, where it joined up with the main Indian trade route down the Ganges. This route through the desert to and from Sindh features prominently in Buddhist sources, which note large caravans of 500 wagons plying it. At the terminus of this route on the Sindhi side of the desert was the extensive Buddhist monastic complex at Mirpur Khas. From the ruins, it's clear that it was once a thriving, wealthy monastery, despite its location. So, its situation should be understood that its importance was because of the location on the important trade route. 2 Buddhist monasteries have also been uncovered along the trade route from Aror through the Bolan Pass and into Afghanistan. The stupa and monastery of Tor Dhairai, situated midway in this route, a large number of potsherds written in Brahmi and Kharoshthi script were found, which record the dedication of a place for the supply of travelers. So it was an isolated Buddhist center served to supply as a supply site and a rest stop for merchants and other travelers who were utilizing the Bolan Pass trade route. At the time of the Arab conquest, this region was ruled by the Kaka family of Buddhist monks. The monastic remains also show that the great majority of Buddhist centers in Sindh were located in the Indus Delta along the main trade route up the valley of the Indus. It's in these areas where the Buddhist merchants, artisans are mentioned in the Muslim sources. For example, Aror, the site of a Buddhist vihar. And here at Aror, the Indus trade route trifurcated, one branch going west to Budhia and the Bolan Pass, another going north along the river to Gandhar, and the third going across the desert to Mathura. The Buddhist center of Nirun was also located on 3 trade routes. The main route north from Debul and up the Indus, the route connecting Brahmanabad and Sevistan, and the route to the monastery at Mirpur Khas across the desert. The monastic remains can be seen as a chain up the Indus via Suvihar, linking the concentration of Buddhist sites in Sindh with those in the Gandhar region via the Khyber Pass to Balkh. The terminus of the trade route in Gandhar was Buddhist around the time of the Conquest and was governed for Yashovarman of Kannauj by Tikin, a devout Buddhist, who was also appointed as superintendent of trade routes or Margapati. Thus, Buddhist merchants traveling north from Sindh, would be welcomed at this point in Gandhar. Along with monasteries, their coin hoards have been found, which shows there was a strong involvement of the monasteries in mercantile enterprises. These hoards have been uncovered at all Buddhist sites in Sindh, which have been extensively excavated and studied, like Mirpur Khas, Depar Ghangro, Kasim Kirio, Mohenjo-daro, Jukad, Sudheranjo-daro. At Mirpur Khas, along with the coins, a statue of a man holding a money bag was found. In his right hand, and it's possible that he could be a wealthy patron of the monastery. At the Buddhist site at Depar Ghangro, which the Muslim historians refer to as Savandi, a large number of lapidaries, houses have been located, showing that this was an important industry here. Semi-precious stones, carnelian, chalcedony, amethystine, quartz, hematite, rock crystal, lapis lazuli, onyx, which were not native to Sindh and must have been imported, cut, polished, drilled at Tepar Gangro by the Buddhist artisans. However, the sources do not make any clear connection of commerce and commercial classes and artisanal classes with Hinduism. The Hindus are referred in Muslim sources, that is the Hindus of Sindh, largely as rulers, administrators, soldiers, and priests, even though the sources are largely silent on rural Sindh. There is evidence that points out that the primary support for the dynasty of Brahmin origin came from the rural sector. Thus, Chach had his original power base in a temple which was situated in the rural hinterland around Aror, and Chach's brother Chandar was reluctant to leave the countryside to take up an administrative position in the city as requested by his brother. The Muslim sources confirm the appointment of rural Brahmins as revenue collectors and officers. So they were given positions in the administration of the pre-Islamic states. There's also evidence that the Brahmins of Sindh had a certain amount of antagonism and contempt towards inter-regional commerce. For example, after the Arabs had conquered the port city of Debul, Raja Dahir replied with derision that this was unimportant because the city was merely the residence of merchants and artisans. The other evidence for the rural basis of Sindhi Hinduism can be seen from the testimony of Hyun Sang, who visited Sindh sometime before the Arab conquest, and he noticed that there were 273 Hindu temples in the region. However, no remains of these have been found, whereas a lot of remains of Buddhist structures have been found. So this shows that most of these temples that he's referring to must have been of perishable material, which were used in local level, village level shrines and in rural construction, whereas the Buddhist structures were more in urban and durable structures.